Imagine finding out that the greatest, like the most profound art form in human history wasn't born from an overflow of creative joy.
Right. Or even from, a desire to just entertain people.
Exactly. What if it was born from sheer, unadulterated existential panic? I mean, just think about that for a second.
It completely flips the script.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because we usually think of high art as the product of a secure, flourishing society, right?
Yeah.
You get comfortable and then you make art.
Yeah, that's the standard assumption.
But what if the most spectacular cultural achievement of the ancient world was actually, well, a desperate survival mechanism?
And that is exactly what we are getting into today.
Yes. Today, we are taking a deep dive into this fascinating set of lectures, notes, and translated materials exploring a literal birth and death narrative.
It really reads like a murder mystery.
It totally does. We're looking at how a spectacular collision of two primal, unstoppable forces gave birth to something magical in ancient Greece. And, how that magic was systematically suffocated.
It is a phenomenal narrative, and I think what makes it so compelling is that we aren't just doing some dusty historical autopsy for the sake of trivia.
Right. This isn't just a history lesson for the listener.
No, not at all. We are looking at a blueprint for human resilience. We're exploring how the ancient Greeks utilized what we'll call the spirit of music as the very lifeblood of their society.
Like a visceral, completely untamed energy.
Exactly. It was this raw energy that allowed them to cope with the absolute horrors of existence. And crucially, we're going to see how that spirit was lost to cold, calculating intellectual construction.
Which is such a tragedy in itself.
It is. But ultimately, this leads us to a concept called tragic thought, which, far from being depressing, is actually a vital, incredibly practical tool.
A tool for enduring the unavoidable hardships and chaos of your own life today.
Precisely.
So, the architect of this incredible theory, the mind behind the materials we're exploring today, is Friedrich Nietzsche.
The one and only.
Right. And before anyone pictures, like, a dusty, unapproachable 19th century philosopher sitting in a dark room writing incomprehensible riddles.
Which is the stereotype, right?
Total stereotype. Let's set the stage for who he was when he proposed this. In the early 1870s, Nietzsche was this young, brilliant, but wildly unconventional classical philology professor.
At Basel University, yeah.
Yeah. And he essentially threw a grenade into the middle of traditional academia. He alienated his entire peer group with these explosive, radical ideas about the ancient Greeks.
He really did not make any friends with this one.
No, he didn't. Because up until he came along, everyone thought of the Greeks in a very specific, sanitized way, didn't they?
They absolutely did. I mean, the prevailing German academic view at the time, and honestly, the view that still persists in a lot of pop culture today, for us was one of cheerful serenity.
Cheerful serenity. Like, everything is just fine.
Right. When people thought of ancient Greece, they pictured perfectly balanced marble statues, men in white togas calmly debating geometry in the sun.
Just a completely rational, enlightened, sunny civilization.
Exactly. And Nietzsche looked at that and essentially said, you are completely delusional.
I love that. Just calling out the whole academic establishment.
He really did. He was like, you are only looking at the very surface. You are looking at a beautifully painted Band-Aid, and you are entirely ignoring the gaping, infected wound it was designed to cover.
Wow. A beautifully painted Band-Aid. That is a stark image.
It's meant to be. He proposed a radical reinterpretation, that the Greeks were deeply, intimately acquainted with the horrors, the violence, and the absurdities of existence.
And that their art was basically a reaction to that trauma.
Exactly. Their art wasn't a luxury, it was a trauma response.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of that trauma. Because if we're going to understand why they needed this massive artistic coping mechanism, we have to understand what they were so afraid of.
Right, we need to know what the Band-Aid is actually covering.
Exactly. And our sources bring up a specific myth that perfectly encapsulates the fundamental problem the Greeks faced. It's known as the wisdom of Silenus.
Yes, the wisdom of Silenus.
Set this up for us. Like, what is this myth, and why does it matter so much to Nietzsche's argument?
So, the myth centers around King Midas.
Wait, like Midas with the golden touch?
Yes, the exact same king. But this is a different story. According to the legend, Midas is hunting in the forest, and he is obsessed with capturing a specific creature, Silenus.
And who is Silenus exactly?
Silenus is a demigod. He's a forest daemon, half man and half beast, who is essentially a companion and tutor to the god Dionysus.
Okay, got it.
So Midas finally manages to trap Silenus in the woods. And he doesn't ask for gold or power, he asks him a deeply philosophical question.
Which is kind of funny to think about. You trap a forest monster and ask for life advice.
Right, it's very Greek. He demands to know what is the most desirable, the absolute best thing of all for humanity to possess.
Which is a heavy, heavy question to drop on a forest creature you just caught in a net. And Silenus doesn't want to answer.
Exactly. Silenus remains completely silent at first. He refuses to speak. He knows the truth is just way too much for a human to bear.
But Midas pushes him.
He does. He mocks him, threatens him, and ultimately forces him to answer. And when Silenus finally opens his mouth, he delivers a truth so utterly devastating that it shatters the illusion of human importance.
Oh man, what does he say?
Well, I'll quote the translation here. He says, "Oh, wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery, why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear?"
Oof. What an opening line.
Right. And then he drops the hammer. He says, "What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon."
To die soon. I mean, it is hard to overstate how incredibly bleak that is.
It really is.
It's the absolute pinnacle of existential dread. He isn't just saying life is hard. He's saying existence itself is a mistake, like a punishment, and the quickest way out is the best option.
It is pure, unadulterated pessimism. And Nietzsche's core argument is that the Greeks didn't just invent this story as some scary campfire tale to frighten children.
Right, they weren't just being edgy.
No, they felt the truth of it in their bones. We have to remember the historical reality of ancient Greece. It wasn't just philosophy and geometry.
It was incredibly brutal.
Exactly. It was a world of brutal hand-to-hand warfare, devastating plagues that could wipe out a third of a city in a month, famine, infant mortality, and the constant looming threat of slavery if your city-state lost a battle.
Yeah, that's something we forget. The stakes of everyday life were just unimaginably high.
And the Moira, the dark, unforgiving, blind fates, they were always hovering over them. The Greeks knew that human life was incredibly fragile, fraught with disaster, and often entirely devoid of justice or fairness.
So if you're a civilization deeply aware of that horrifying reality, if you wake up every day knowing that the absolute best thing would be to have never been born, how do you get out of bed?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, how do you build a society or plant crops or raise children if you genuinely believe the universe is essentially a meat grinder? You would just collapse into mass despair.
Exactly. You would experience total societal paralysis.
Yeah.
To survive this crushing reality, the Greeks needed a psychological survival mechanism.
A way to process the horror.
Yes, a way to process the horror of existence without being completely destroyed by it. And this leads us to the first of the two primal forces Nietzsche identifies.
Okay, here we go.
To save themselves from the wisdom of Silenus, the Greeks created the Olympian gods, driven by what Nietzsche calls the Apollonian spirit.
Right, Apollo. But we need to define how Nietzsche is using Apollo here, because it's much deeper than just thinking of him as the god who drives the sun chariot across the sky.
Oh, absolutely.
What is the psychological mechanism of the Apollonian spirit in this context?
So, in this philosophical framework, Apollo represents the dream world. He is the patron of what we call the plastic arts.
Let's clarify that term real quick, because plastic arts can sound pretty confusing to a modern ear. We aren't talking about like synthetic polymers or Tupperware.
No, not at all. Plastic arts refer to arts that involve molding, shaping, and establishing physical form and boundaries.
Like sculpture.
Exactly. Think of perfectly proportioned marble sculptures, majestic architecture, or even the grand structure, almost architectural epic poetry of Homer.
So it's about structure.
Yes, Apollo is the god of boundaries. He is the god of clear lines, of light, of symmetry, and crucially, he represents the principle of individuality. In philosophy, this is called the principium individuationis.
The principle of individuation, meaning the idea that I am me, you are you, the tree is the tree, and there are clear, defined borders between all of us.
Precisely. The Apollonian spirit is all about drawing a line and saying, here is where I end, and where the rest of the chaotic universe begins.
It's a way of making sense of the mess.
It is. It's the spirit behind the famous Greek maxim, know thyself. It demands measure, proportion, and the avoidance of excess. It's the desire to make the world understandable by breaking it down into distinct, manageable, beautiful forms.
So if we look at the Olympian god Zeus throwing lightning bolts, Athena in her armor, Apollo, with his liar Nietzsche, is suggesting this wasn't just a naive, primitive religion.
Right.
It wasn't that the Greeks simply didn't know how bad life could be, so they invented some happy sky people to feel better.
Quite the opposite. This is a profound shift in how we understand their religion. The Greeks didn't have a comforting theology.
No, they really didn't.
They didn't have a promise of a blissful heaven waiting for them if they were good. Their underworld, Hades, was a bleak, miserable, shadowy place where the dead just wandered aimlessly.
Right. There was no ultimate cosmic justice waiting for them after death to make up for the suffering of life.
Exactly. Therefore, the Olympian gods had to serve a totally different function. They were an artificial, beautifully crafted veil. Yes. They were a deliberate, artistic illusion placed directly over the terrifying truth of Silenus.
That is such a powerful image. A beautiful veil over a terrifying truth. It makes me think about how we try to cope with overwhelming horror today.
How do you mean?
Well, it's not like ignoring a messy room. It's more profound. It's like if you're forced to live next to an active, terrifying volcano that could destroy you at any moment, you don't just pretend it's not there.
Right, because you can't.
Exactly. So instead, you build magnificent stained glass cathedral right at the base of it. And when you look up, you see the glowing, beautiful art, and the light filtering through the glass protects your eyes from the blinding, destructive fire just outside.
Oh, I love.
The volcano's still there, the danger is entirely real, but the aesthetic beauty makes living in its shadow endurable.
That is an excellent analogy. The cathedral doesn't extinguish the volcano, but it intercepts the terror.
Yeah, it gives you a buffer.
Exactly. The Greeks looked at the chaotic, senseless suffering of their lives, and through the Apollonian spirit, they projected a magnificent glowing mirror into the heavens. The gods were idealized, dreamlike versions of humans.
They were just like us, but bigger.
Yes. They fought, they loved, they suffered, they felt jealousy and rage, but they did it on a grand, immortal, aesthetically perfect scale.
They aestheticized their own existence.
Exactly. Nietzsche argues that the Greeks justified human life by showing that the gods themselves lived it. By seeing their own tragic, messy lives reflected in this divine, beautiful mirror, the misery was transformed into epic drama.
So the illusion is a shield.
Yes. The Apollonian illusion protects you from the paralyzing glare of absolute truth. It is the instinct for self-preservation manifesting as art. The Greeks used beauty to tame the horror. They needed the dream to survive the reality.
But, a dream is still just a dream. And no matter how thick the stained glass in that cathedral is, or how beautiful the marble statues are, a veil can only hold back raw, chaotic nature for so long.
Right, the pressure builds.
Eventually, the volcano erupts. The ground shakes. And that brings us to the second massive force in this narrative. The complete polar opposite of Apollo.
Yes, the other half of the equation.
Right. If Apollo is the dream of boundaries, the second force is the waking nightmare, or perhaps the profound ecstasy of having those boundaries entirely obliterated.
We move from the dream to the intoxication. We move to Dionysus.
Let's really dig into Dionysus, because honestly, the modern pop culture version of Dionysus, or Bacchus in the Roman tradition, has been severely downgraded.
Oh, completely.
People think of him as just the god of wine, the god of partying, sort of the frat boy of Mount Olympus who just wants everyone to have a good time.
Right, like he's just hosting a never-ending toga party.
Exactly. But the sources we're looking at paint a picture of Dionysian energy that is vastly deeper, older, and frankly, deeply unsettling.
It is unsettling because it represents the complete systematic dissolution of everything the Apollonian spirit works so hard to build.
The tearing down of the walls.
Oh, yes. If Apollo is about strict boundaries, logic, and the preservation of the individual ego, Dionysus is the apocalyptic shattering of all boundaries. Dionysus represents the raw, untamed, churning forces of nature.
Like the forces that are bigger than us.
Think of the chaotic, violent frenzy of spring bursting forth from the dead earth, or the overwhelming power of absolute intoxication.
And when we say intoxication, we aren't just talking about having a few too many glasses of wine with dinner. We're talking about a fundamental shift in human consciousness.
We are talking about the collapse of the principium individuationis.
That boundary we talked about earlier.
Exactly. In the true Dionysian state, the psychological walls that separate you from me and separate humanity from the natural world completely collapse. The individual ego is annihilated.
You cease to be a distinct person.
Right. You cease to be a person with a name, a job, and a rational mind, and you merge back into the collective, primal will of nature itself.
I mean, The descriptions of these ancient Dionysian festivals are wild. It sounds like absolute terrifying madness. The rigid societal rules of ancient Greece, which were very strict regarding class and status, by the way, they just evaporate instantly.
Total social leveling.
Yeah. Slaves and free men, nobles and peasants, are suddenly dancing together in the same ecstatic, sweating mass. The text mentions that wild animals like panthers and tigers walk peacefully among the crowds, pulling the god's chariot.
It's a return to nature.
Right. You forget how to walk normally, how to speak in sentences, and you feel this overwhelming sensation of floating, of being possessed by something immensely powerful.
To understand this, we have to look at the very real psychological phenomenon of mass crowd behavior. Nietzsche compares these ancient Greek rites to the St. John and St. Vitus dancers of the Middle Ages.
Oh, right. The dancing plagues, I've read about those. It wasn't a myth, it was a real historical event.
It absolutely was.
Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people in medieval Europe would suddenly start dancing in the streets, literally unable to stop, traveling from town to town in this massive writhing crowd until they literally collapsed from exhaustion or died of heart attacks.
Exactly. Now, modern medical historians often classify those events as mass psychogenic illness or stress-induced hysteria, but Nietzsche views them through a completely different lens.
How so?
He sees them as the explosive resurfacing of a fundamental human drive. Look, the Apollonian world requires constant, exhausting effort to maintain.
It takes work to be an individual.
Exactly. It takes energy to suppress your instincts, to follow the rules, to maintain your distinct identity. The Dionysian impulse is the overwhelming, irresistible desire to let all of that go. It is the urge to escape the lonely prison of the self and dissolve back into the universal whole.
Wow. Lonely prison of the self. And the primary vehicle, the universal language of this Dionysian spirit, is music.
Yes, music is the key.
But again, we have to be very careful with our definitions here. We are not talking about the measured mathematical architectural music of Apollo's lyre. We aren't talking about gentle background music you play at a dinner party to set a polite mood.
No, the Apollonian music was essentially just a rhythmic framework to support poetry. It was an extension of the plastic arts, orderly, predictable, and boundary-affirming.
So what was Dionysian music?
Dionysian music is the complete opposite. It is raw, harmonic, rhythmically complex, soul-shaking music. It does not attempt to represent a specific object or tell a linear story.
It's pure feeling.
Yes. Instead of representing an object, it directly expresses the underlying chaotic will of the universe. It channels the profound, terrifying suffering and the immense joy of nature itself.
This makes so much sense when you think about how we experience different types of art. There's a section in our notes that touches on how fragmented the modern human experience of art is compared to the ancients.
The fragmentation is a huge point.
Right? Today, if I want to experience poetry, I sit in a quiet room, completely alone, and I read black text printed on a white page. It is a completely silent, intellectual exercise processed entirely by my prefrontal cortex.
Very Apollonian.
Exactly. And if I want music, I put on headphones and listen to an instrumental track. We have completely separated the word from the sound.
That fragmentation is entirely Apollonian. We dissect art to consume it safely. But for the ancient Greeks, especially before the rise of writing as the primary medium, poetry and music were inextricably, organically linked.
They were one thing.
Yes, you didn't read a poem, you learned it through its specific melody. The word, the rhythm, the pitch, and the physical act of singing were a single, unified experience. The body was involved just as much as the mind.
I want to really ground this in a modern feeling, because the contrast between these two forces is so vital to everything we're talking about today.
It's the core of the whole theory.
Right. It sounds exactly like the difference between how you behave in an art museum versus how you behave at a massive electronic music festival.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison. Let's unpack that.
Well, think about it. If you walk into a prestigious art gallery that is pure Apollo, the lighting is completely controlled. The paintings are constrained within heavy, gilded frames.
Boundaries everywhere.
Exactly. You stand at a polite distance, separate from the art, separate from the other patrons, and you use your intellect to judge the brushstrokes or the historical context. You are highly aware of yourself as an individual observing an object.
And you are expected to remain quiet and still. Your physical body is entirely restrained.
Right. But then imagine taking that exact same person and dropping them into the middle of a massive rave or a heavy metal concert. You're shoulder to shoulder in a crowd of 50,000 people in the dark.
Complete sensory overload.
Yes. The bass is so loud, it is literally vibrating the water molecules inside your chest cavity. The lights are blinding and pulsing to the beat. In that environment, you literally cannot hear yourself think.
The intellect shuts down.
And for a moment, you completely lose your sense of self. You aren't John the accountant anymore. You are just one cell in this massive, breathing, sweating, jumping organism that is reacting involuntarily to the rhythm. That total ego death, that surrender to the sound that is Dionysus.
That is a phenomenal parallel. The physical sensation of the bass vibrating in your chest, bypassing your conscious thought, that is the exact mechanism of Dionysian music Nietzsche is describing. It hits the nervous system directly.
It's primal.
It is. However, we must introduce a critical caveat here, one that the Greeks understood perfectly. Pure Dionysian frenzy, left entirely unchecked, is highly dangerous. It is fundamentally destructive to human society.
Right, because if you never leave the rave, if the ego never reforms, you can't build a functioning civilization. You can't farm or pass laws or raise families if everyone is permanently dissolved in a state of ecstatic trance.
Precisely. And the text provides a chilling example of this by pointing to the Sakai festivals of Babylon.
What happened there?
These were festivals where the Dionysian impulse was unleashed without any Apollonian restraint to temper it. And the result wasn't just dancing. It dissolved into absolute, horrific chaos.
Like destructive chaos.
Yes, it led to total sexual indiscipline, the destruction of family structures, violence, and the complete tearing apart of the social fabric. It was humans literally devolving back into feral beasts.
So that's not sustainable.
Not at all. So the unique magic of ancient Greece, the absolute miracle of their culture, was not that they discovered Dionysus. It was what happened when these two diametrically opposed, immensely powerful gods met on the battlefield of the human psyche.
And what happened?
Instead of destroying each other, they struck a miraculous truce.
And that incredibly fragile, dynamic truce. That perfect tension between the dream of Apollo and the intoxication of Dionysus.
Yeah.
That is what gave birth to Greek tragedy.
Exactly. This brings us to the birth phase of our narrative. Greek tragedy was not just a new genre of storytelling. It was the ultimate perfect synthesis of these two immense psychological forces.
Let's explore the actual mechanics of this synthesis. How did this philosophical truce physically manifest on a stage?
We have to wipe away all our modern conceptions.
Yeah, completely wipe away our modern conception of what going to the theater means. When we think of theater, we picture sitting in the dark in plush velvet chairs, quietly watching actors behave like normal people on a well-lit stage, pretending we aren't there.
Like staring into a dollhouse.
Exactly. That is not what was happening in Athens in the 5th century BC. The physical reality of the Greek stage was an overwhelming sensory experience.
It was a massive civic and religious event. We are talking about tens of thousands of spectators, sometimes up to 20,000 people, sitting in a colossal outdoor amphitheater carved into the side of a hill.
And it wasn't dark. They were performing in the glaring, bright Mediterranean sunlight.
Yes, and the performers themselves were visually astonishing. The actors wore massive, towering masks that were designed to be seen from the very back row of the amphitheater.
I read those masks were huge.
Huge. And these masks also acted as primitive megaphones to amplify their voices. They walked on elevated stilts or thick-soled boots called cothurni.
Which made them look, like, terrifyingly tall.
Right, terrifying, larger-than-life giants moving across the stage. And the vocal exertion required was just staggering. An actor had to project his voice to be heard clearly by 20,000 people outdoors, sometimes delivering over 1,000 lines of verse in a single day.
It sounds less like a play and more like a massive, terrifying religious spectacle. But let's break down where the two gods live in this space. Our sources point out that the foundation, the very womb of tragedy, was the chorus.
The chorus is everything.
Right. So where does the chorus fit into the Apollo-Dionysus dynamic?
The chorus was the absolute heart of the tragedy. Modern audiences often view the chorus as like an annoying interruption.
Yeah, like a group of background singers who just pop up to narrate what just happened.
Exactly. But originally, the chorus was the main event. The chorus was the physical embodiment of the Dionysian mass. They sang what was called the dithyramb.
What did a dithyramb actually sound like? Is it like a church choir?
Far from it. A dithyramb was a wild, impassioned, rhythmic, choral song and dance dedicated to Dionysus. Imagine 50 men moving in synchronized, complex patterns, stamping their feet and singing in powerful, resonant harmony.
That sounds intense.
It was. The Datharam didn't just tell a story, it created an overwhelming wall of sound that was designed to induce a trance-like state in the audience. The chorus was the audience's direct, visceral link to the primal, chaotic will of nature.
Expressing the suffering of existence.
Exactly. They express the profound, universal suffering of existence, but also the ecstatic joy of being alive.
Okay, so the orchestra pit, where the chorus is dancing and singing, is this swirling vortex of Dionysian energy. So where's Apollo?
Apollo's up on the stage.
To the actors.
Right. The towering actors in their massive, beautiful masks, speaking in measured, poetic dialogue, they are the Apollonian projections. Nietzsche proposes a radical way of visualizing this. The action on the stage is essentially a shared vision being dreamed up by the Dionysian chorus.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping this. You're saying the characters on stage aren't the real focus?
Not initially, no.
The chorus is generating the emotional energy, and the actors are just the holographic projection of that energy.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it, yes. The text insists that the great heroes of tragedy, Oedipus, Prometheus, Agamemnon, they weren't originally understood as unique individuals with complex, distinct psychologies.
The audience wasn't analyzing Oedipus's childhood trauma.
No, not at all. Nietzsche argues that all of these heroes were actually just different masks for one single entity, the suffering god Dionysus.
This completely upends how we are taught to read these plays. If the hero on stage is just a mask for the suffering god, does that mean the audience wasn't actually watching a story unfold in the way we binge-watch a drama series?
Right, they weren't sitting there guessing the plot.
They weren't sitting on the edge of their stone seats wondering, oh my gosh, what is Oedipus going to do next? Is he going to figure out who his mother is? They already knew all the myths inside and out before they even sat down.
Precisely. They knew the plot. Therefore, the goal of the performance was not narrative suspense. Tragedy, in its golden age with playwrights like Aeschylus, was not initially about drama in the modern sense of action, plot twists, and character arcs.
It was about pathos.
Entirely about pathos, emotion, suffering. The audience was there to participate in a shared religious ritual. The overwhelming, hypnotic music of the chorus allowed the audience to bypass their intellectual defenses.
To just feel it.
Yes, to directly, physically, feel the agony and the ultimate transcendence of the god being torn apart and reborn.
So the Apollonian dialogue on the stage, the beautiful poetry, the structure of the scenes that is just the stained glass window protecting the audience from the blinding, raw emotion of the music.
The cathedral we talked about.
Exactly. The dialogue gives the mind something beautiful and logical to focus on, while the music does the real heavy lifting of processing the existential terror.
You have hit the nail on the head. The Apollonian form makes the Dionysian suffering endurable. It gives it shape. Without the music, the words are hollow. Without the words, the music is too chaotic to process.
And to prove how vital this musical foundation was, our sources highlight a very specific historical misconception that I find absolutely fascinating.
Oh, the Florentine Camerata?
Yes. It proves what happens when you try to separate these elements.
Let's talk about the 17th century Florentines and the invention of opera, because they thought they were bringing Greek tragedy back to life, didn't they?
They did, and it is one of the greatest ironies in art history. The group in question was the Florentine Camerata.
And who were they?
They were a circle of very wealthy, highly educated, fiercely intellectual aristocrats and musicians in Renaissance Italy. They looked back at ancient Greece with intense admiration, and they decided they wanted to invent a new art form that recreated the profound emotional power of Greek tragedy.
So they invented opera. And so they invented modern opera. But Nietzsche argues they failed spectacularly because they completely misunderstood the foundational mechanics of what Greek tragedy actually was.
Where did they go wrong? I mean, they had singing, they had characters, they had tragic plots. It seems like the right ingredients.
They had the ingredients, but they reversed the hierarchy. The Florentines were men of the Renaissance. They worshipped the intellect.
So they favored Apollo.
Oh, completely. Therefore, they believed that the true power of tragedy must have come from the words, the poetry, the logical progression of the narrative. They viewed music as a dangerous, chaotic element that needed to be controlled.
That makes sense for Renaissance thinkers.
Right. So they decided that music should just be a decorative backdrop to ensure the words were heard clearly and understood intellectually.
They invented what the text calls reading music.
Yes, they created a highly artificial, intellectualized form of singing known as stylo representativo. The music was entirely subservient to the text. They essentially used the music to color code the dialogue.
What do you mean by color code?
Well, If the text mentioned the bright sun, the orchestra would play a high, bright major chord. If the character mentioned walking into a dark forest, the music would suddenly shift to a low, ominous minor key.
Oh, wow. It's incredibly literal.
Extremely literal.
It's the musical equivalent of a paint-by-numbers kit. It's entirely logical.
And in doing so, they stripped away the unconscious, organic, soul-shaking magic of the Dionysian spirit. They made music a slave to the rational intellect, rather than the raw, untamed voice of nature.
Because they were scared of Dionysus.
Yes. They wanted clear, crisp, perfectly understandable Apollo, but they were terrified of the messy, intoxicating, irrational depth of Dionysus. They thought they could achieve the profound emotional catharsis of tragedy without ever letting go of their individual egos.
And the ultimate tragedy here, the real twist of the knife in Nietzsche's narrative, is that by stripping away the music to focus entirely on the intellect and the words, the Florentines weren't inventing something new. They were actually just repeating the exact same crime that murdered Greek tragedy thousands of years earlier.
Indeed, we have explored the miraculous birth of this art form. Now we must examine its assassination.
Every murder mystery needs a villain. And in Nietzsche's telling of this history, the villain who single-handedly destroyed the greatest artistic achievement of the ancient world is the playwright Euripides.
Euripides.
Now, I have to step in here and play defense for a moment, because anyone who has studied theater history knows Euripides is considered one of the big three tragedians.
Right, alongside Aeschylus and Sophocles.
Exactly. He wrote some of the most famous plays in history, like Medea and the Trojan Women. He is studied and revered. So how can Nietzsche possibly frame him as the murderer of the art form? What did he do that was so unforgivable?
To understand Nietzsche's hostility toward Euripides, we have to look at how he fundamentally altered the mechanics of the stage.
Okay, what did he alter?
Well, Aeschylus and Sophocles, the older playwrights, relied heavily on the music, the myth, the power of the chorus, and the unconscious emotional connection with the audience. They kept the heroes larger than life. But Euripides did something radical.
Something that felt like progress, maybe.
Yes, something that felt like progress to the rational mind, but was fatal to the Dionysian spirit. He brought the spectator onto the stage.
What does that mean in practical terms? He brought the spectator onto the stage. Did he literally, pull people out of the audience?
No, it means he shrank the mythic heroes down to the size of normal men. He made the characters reflect everyday, mundane, recognizable reality.
So he made them ordinary.
Exactly. He took that grand Apollonian mirror that showed humans an idealized divine version of themselves processing immense suffering, and he replaced it with a regular, flat glass mirror that just showed the audience their ordinary, flawed, daily lives.
The characters on stage stopped sounding like towering archetypes.
Right, and they started sounding exactly like the people sitting in the audience.
Okay, but again, pushing back here. To a modern audience, that sounds like a massive improvement. We like relatable characters, we like psychological realism. Why is making characters act like real people a bad thing?
Because to make them act like normal, rational people, he had to kill the music.
Real people don't process their grief by spontaneously erupting into a synchronized, polyrhythmic death-a-ram with 50 other people.
I mean, true. That would be weird.
Right. Real people argue, they debate, they rationalize, and so Euripides killed the Dionysian spirit by relying on dialectics.
Dialectics. Let's unpack that term. That's a philosophical term for logical argumentation, right?
Yes. Specifically, the process of arriving at truth through the exchange of logical arguments, theses, and antitheses. In a Euripidean play, instead of characters pouring out their immense suffering in a tidal wave of musical emotion, they began defending their actions with sharp, calculated logic.
So it became more like a debate club.
It became like watching an incredibly articulate courtroom drama. The characters are constantly debating, rationalizing their motives, and trying to outsmart each other with words.
The raw emotion was lost.
The raw, visceral outpouring of the chorus was pushed aside, replaced by the sharp, cold clash of intellects. And Euripides didn't just stumble into this stylistic change by accident. He wasn't just trying to be trendy. Our sources argue he was driven by a very specific, aggressive philosophy, a worldview that was spreading like a virus through Athens at the time. This is what Nietzsche labels Socratism.
Named, of course, after Socrates.
Right. Socrates, the godfather of Western philosophy, the man who invented the Socratic method, the foundation of the scientific method, the guy who famously drank the hemlock rather than compromise his pursuit of truth.
A giant of history.
Exactly. So again, I have to ask, Socrates gave us the tools of rationality that built the modern world. How on earth does Nietzsche justify calling him a destructive force?
This is where Nietzsche is at his most provocative. He argues that Socrates operated on a core, unshapable belief. Virtue is knowledge. Everything must be conscious to be good.
If you can't explain it, it's not good.
Exactly. If you cannot fully understand something intellectually, if you cannot explain its logical mechanics, then it cannot be inherently good. So Euripides, who was a close associate of Socrates, took that philosophical principle and applied it directly to aesthetics and art.
And what was his new rule?
His new rule for theater became everything must be conscious to be beautiful.
Oh, wow. Now, see the collision course now. If your rule is everything must be conscious to be beautiful, then if you cannot explain exactly why a piece of art moves you, if you cannot break it down into a logical formula, then it isn't actually good art.
It's invalid to them.
That completely outlaws the idea of unconscious genius. It outlaws the mystery of the dithyramb. It outlaws the entire concept of getting lost in the music, because getting lost is, by definition, an unconscious act.
Precisely. It actively outlaws the Dionysian. It demands that the deep, dark, irrational well springs of human emotion be dragged forcefully into the harsh, analytical, fluorescent light of day.
So how did this manifest on stage?
We can see exactly how Euripides implemented this demand for logical clarity in his plays. The text provides some brilliant, specific examples of his stage mechanics.
Let's hear them. How do you logically optimize a tragedy?
Take the prologue, for instance. In the older Dionysian tragedies of Aeschylus, you were just dropped immediately into the heavy, tense emotional atmosphere. The music started, the mood was set, and you felt the dread before you understood the plot.
You just vibed with it.
Right. But Euripides hated that ambiguity. He couldn't stand the audience being confused for even a moment, so he would literally have a character, often a god or the main hero, walk out onto the empty stage at the very beginning of the play and painstakingly explain the entire backstory directly to the audience.
Just a data dump.
Exactly. Hello, my name is Medea. Here is exactly what happened before the play started. Here are my current motivations, and here is generally what you can expect to see today.
He killed the mystery.
Yeah.
He didn't want the audience to have to use their imagination or feel their way through the narrative. He wanted all the data laid out in a spreadsheet before the meeting began.
Exactly. And his demand for logical neatness also ruined the endings of his plays. Euripides became notorious for his reliance on the deus ex machina.
The god from the machine.
Yes. Because Euripides replaced organic, musical emotion with complex, logical argumentation, his characters would often debate themselves into corners.
They outlogic themselves.
Yes. The plots became so tangled in rationalizations and counterarguments that there was no natural, human way to resolve the conflict. So, to ensure the play ended with logical neatness, Euripides would literally have a stagehand operate a wooden crane to lower an actor playing a god from the ceiling down to the stage.
Just drop a god in to fix it.
Literally. This god would step off the crane, wave a magic wand, tell everyone who was right and who was wrong, neatly tie up all the loose plot threads, and deliver a rational conclusion.
It is the ultimate intellectual cheat code.
It is, and the text makes a stunning philosophical comparison here. It compares Euripides using the mechanical crane of the deus ex machina to the 17th century philosopher René Descartes using the concept of God to prove the reality of the physical world.
Oh, that's interesting.
In both cases, it is a mechanical, intellectual shortcut. It is a forced, artificial rationalization of an incredibly complex, irrational situation. It proves that when logic traps itself, it has to invent a machine to save itself.
And Nietzsche is incredibly critical of Socrates' own psychology, too.
Yeah.
He calls Socrates the first theoretical man.
Yes, theoretical man.
There is a detail about Socrates' famous demonic voice that perfectly illustrates how deeply reversed his psychology was compared to the tragic Greeks. Can you explain that mechanism?
Socrates frequently claimed that he was guided by an inner divine voice, a demon. But the text points out something bizarre and revealing about this voice. It only ever spoke up to hinder him. It only ever told him what not to do.
Why is that significant?
Because for a true Dionysian artist, and really for any healthy, instinctively driven human being, instinct is the positive, forward-moving, creative force.
It pushes you to do things.
Exactly. The unconscious mind drives the creation, and the conscious, logical mind acts as the editor, the critic that sometimes steps in to slow you down or refine the edges.
So Socrates was backwards.
Yes. In Socrates, that natural order was entirely reversed. His conscious, logical, calculating mind was his driving, creative force, and his deepest instinct was reduced to a negative, critical voice that only ever said stop.
Wow.
He was a monstrous psychological anomaly. He was a man entirely divorced from the wellspring of unconscious natural wisdom.
Okay, here is where we reach the absolute crux of the argument. I've played devil's advocate, I've defended logic, but now we have to confront Nietzsche's core thesis.
Let's do it.
Euripides replaced wild, chaotic emotion with clear, logical argument. He made the plots easier to follow, he made the characters relatable. Socrates promoted the idea that human intelligence can understand the world. Why does Nietzsche, and why does this narrative, treat this shift toward intellectual construction as a catastrophic loss? Why is logic not the upgrade it claims to be?
That is the pivotal question of this entire deep dive. Why is Socratic optimism, the fundamental belief that logic can solve everything, actually a destructive, dangerous force?
Yeah, why is optimism bad?
The answer lies in the fragile nature of optimism itself. Logic and rationality operate on a strict promise of cause and effect. They promise that the universe is essentially a massive puzzle, and if you just think hard enough, you can uncover its secrets.
That there's an answer for everything.
Right. They promise that if you act virtuously, you will be rewarded. They promise that every single problem has a rational solution and every suffering has a logical, understandable cause.
Which, again, sounds wonderful on paper. It is the foundation of science.
Yeah.
It is the reason we have modern medicine and engineering.
It is wonderful for engineering, but it is disastrous for the human soul when dealing with the reality of existence. Because the real world, as the terrifying wisdom of Silenus warned the Greeks, is not fundamentally rational.
It just isn't.
It does not operate on human logic. Bad things happen to good people with alarming frequency. Senseless tragedy strikes without warning or reason. Children get sick. Earthquakes destroy cities. The universe is entirely indifferent to our dialectics and our syllogisms. So, the danger is this. If your entire worldview, your entire mechanism for survival, is built on the fragile optimism of logic, what happens when you encounter a suffering that has no rational explanation? What happens when logic inevitably fails?
You break. Your worldview shatters completely. If you believe the universe is a fair, solvable math equation, and then you encounter a massive, painful variable that simply does not compute, you aren't just sad. You are left with total, paralyzing despair. You feel betrayed by the universe.
Precisely. Socratic optimism sets us up for a catastrophic, inevitable fall. It actively robs us of the psychological tools required to process the inexplicable.
Because we threw out the Dionysian tools.
Yes. By demanding that everything be conscious, neat, and rational, Socrates and Euripides killed the very mechanism, the tragic, musical, Dionysian mechanism that allowed the Greeks to look directly into the yawning abyss of senseless suffering and say a powerful yes to life anyway.
They traded deep resilience for fragile intellect.
They traded deep, resilient emotional processing for superficial, fragile intellectualization. And in doing so, they left Western civilization incredibly vulnerable to despair when the illusion of control shatters.
Which brings us beautifully to the final and, frankly, the most important part of our journey today. We have spent an hour dissecting the aesthetics of a 2,500-year-old civilization. But what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now?
How does it apply today?
Exactly. We aren't ancient Greeks sitting in a stone amphitheater. We aren't arguing with Socrates in the agora. Why does the murder of this ancient art form matter to someone listening to this while they're commuting to work or while they're washing the dishes in their kitchen?
It matters intensely because the Socratic worldview, that theoretical, hyper-rational, cause and effect optimism, is the very water we swim in today.
We are swimming in it.
We live in a society that is completely intoxicated by the belief that science, data, reason, and optimization can solve every mystery of the universe and fix all human suffering.
We really do believe that.
We genuinely believe there is a life hack for every pain, a logical explanation for every grief, a therapy protocol for every trauma, and a pill for every sadness. We are the ultimate children of Socrates.
We are obsessed with fixing things instead of feeling them.
Exactly. But Nietzsche's prophetic warning is that eventually this scientific optimism hits a wall. Logic inevitably bites its own tail. We reach the absolute limits of what can be explained by data.
You can't spreadsheet a tragedy.
No, you can't. We encounter the death of a loved one, a terminal diagnosis, or simply the overwhelming, chaotic absurdity of modern global events. Science can tell us the biological mechanism of a disease, but it cannot tell us why it happened to this person at this time, and it cannot give meaning to the suffering.
And when we hit that wall?
At that wall, we are left staring into the abyss of the inexplicable.
We all hit that wall eventually. It is the one guarantee in life. So when the logic breaks down, What is the alternative? How do we survive the wisdom of Silenus today?
This is where the concept of tragic thought becomes our most vital tool. The Greeks did not use tragedy to logically solve their problems. They didn't watch Oedipus to figure out how to avoid his mistakes.
They didn't take notes on what not to do.
Right. They used tragedy to look directly, unflinchingly at the horrors and absurdities of life, and through the power of art and music, transform that nausea into something endurable. They didn't deny the pain with toxic positivity, they aestheticized it.
How do we do that practically? Our sources mention two specific psychological shifts the Greeks used within tragic thought, utilizing the sublime to tame horror and the comic to release the tension of the absurd.
Think about the sublime like this. When you are faced with a massive Category 5 hurricane, you cannot logic it away. You cannot debate it. But if you can step back and stand in awe of its terrifying, majestic, sublime power, you shift your relationship to it.
You stop trying to control it.
You recognize yourself as a small part of a massive, awe-inspiring universe. And regarding the comic, when life is so ridiculously unfair, when the bureaucracy of existence is so nonsensical that it makes your head spin, sometimes the only valid survival mechanism is to laugh at the cosmic absurdity of it.
Just laugh at it.
It releases the pressure valve that logic tries to keep clamped shut.
So, embracing the Dionysian spirit today means accepting that pain, chaos, and the loss of individual control are not errors in your personal code. They are not bugs in the system. They are natural, inevitable features of the universal will.
It's just part of being alive.
It is the profound understanding that you are part of a larger, churning, sometimes destructive natural order.
Yes. And when you truly accept that, you build profound resilience.
I want to be very clear here, because someone might hear this and think, well, that sounds incredibly depressing. Just accept that life is chaotic and painful. But tragic thought isn't about wallowing in sadness, is it?
Quite the opposite. It is the most fiercely life-affirming philosophy imaginable. It allows you to look at the absolute worst that life has to offer, to experience the suffering deeply and musically, without turning away, and still say a resounding, defiant yes to existence.
It's a choice to say yes.
It is a robust, battle-tested affirmation of life. Contrast that with the fragile, paper-thin optimism of the hyper-rational modern mind, which shatters the moment its carefully constructed spreadsheet of life is corrupted by reality.
So to synthesize this entire journey for you, the listener, it sounds like Nietzsche's narrative is a massive, echoing warning against what we would call today toxic positivity and our cultural obsession with hyper-rationality.
A huge warning.
He is telling us that to survive modern life, to truly endure the things that break our hearts and our minds, we need to stop trying to intellectually solve every emotional problem we have. We cannot logic our way out of grief.
You really can't.
We need to find a way to musically, artistically feel our way through the chaos instead of always trying to outthink it.
That is precisely the takeaway. We cannot spreadsheet our way out of existential dread. We must recover the capacity to feel deeply, to connect with the underlying chaotic current of existence, even when it hurts.
We need the music back.
We desperately need the spirit of music, the Dionysian release, to process the things that words, data, and logic fundamentally fail to capture.
Let's wrap this up. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by confronting the terrifying dark truth of existence that the ancient Greeks faced the wisdom of Silenus. The idea that it might be better not to be born at all.
Heavy stuff.
Very heavy.
Wow.
We saw how they brilliantly survived that truth by weaving together the beautiful, structuring, protective dream of Apollo with the raw, musical, boundary-shattering frenzy of Dionysus. They created tragedy, a perfect artistic machine designed for processing human suffering.
The perfect machine.
Then we witnessed the murder of that art form. We saw how the intellectual, logical obsession of Euripides and the relentless dialectics of Socrates killed the vital spirit of music, replacing profound, healing emotion with sterile courtroom debates.
And we suffer for it today.
But most importantly, we learned that reclaiming tragic thought, accepting the chaos, aestheticizing the pain, and feeling our way through it can be our ultimate tool for resilience in a hyper-rational modern world.
And this brings us to one final, deeply poignant detail from our sources. It is a detail that provides a perfect coda to this entire discussion. It concerns Socrates himself, the ultimate theoretical man, the architect of Western rationality.
Oh, I love this part.
At the very end of his life, he was sitting in a prison cell, having been condemned to death, awaiting his execution. And in those final days, the text notes that this man of pure intellect began having recurring dreams.
What were the dreams?
The dream kept telling him the exact same cryptic thing Socrates practiced music.
Wow.
This man who had spent his entire life elevating logic, demanding conscious understanding, and dissecting the world with reason. Suddenly, in the face of his own impending death, when logic could no longer save him, he felt the desperate urge to write poetry.
That is just incredible.
He realized, entirely too late, that in his pursuit of absolute rationality, he had neglected a fundamental, vital part of the human experience.
Even the ultimate rationalist realized he needed the music when the end finally came.
Exactly. So the question we leave you with today is this. Look at your own highly structured, data-driven, logically optimized life. Where are you suffocating your own inner music?
That is a great question.
What would happen if you stopped trying to solve every single piece of your existence like a math problem to be mastered, and instead finally let the Dionysian chorus back into your mind?
Think about that the next time you find yourself desperately trying to find a clean binary answer to a messy, painful human problem. The rational X-ray machine might be broken. The logic might fail. But maybe that just means it's time to stop thinking and start listening to the music instead. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking beneath the beautiful veils, and we will catch you next time.